Well, somebody who's been observing Ukraine, the Ukraine-Russia war, and what the situation is very, very closely for the last several years, Shashank Joshi, he joins us now, the defense editor of The Economist. Thanks, Shashank, very much for being with us. We met a couple of days back in Munich, and there was a sense that something unexpected could take place with strong statements from J.D. Vance and strong statements from Trump prior to that. Nothing really has taken place, at least nothing that's resulted in the end of the war. So I'm going to throw out a couple of scenarios for you just to get your reactions on what may actually take place. Firstly, the possibility that talks stretch on indefinitely, led possibly by Putin stating that he wasn't willing to budge and accept any terms and conditions. Is this a possibility which would mean that, look, we would see even more loss of lives going forward?
Vishnu, I think it is a possibility. We know from all of the European and American intelligence assessments that the Russian government's objectives remain pretty maximalist. That is, the subjugation of Ukraine, no foreign troops in Ukraine, a neutralized, relatively disarmed Ukraine. You know the list. However, I will say that in the week or so since you and I chatted in Munich, America has given concession after concession to the Russians. The Russians will be delighted by the exclusion of Ukraine from the talks, the invitation back to the G7, the Americans pushing a resolution at the Security Council that makes no mention of Russian aggression. And so for that reason, I feel the Russians will feel pretty confident that they can get something out of this process, which makes it less likely that they will simply walk away from these talks. But we are a long way from any significant, serious, immediate haggling right now.
Could we see a situation where Trump actually runs out of patience unless Russia acts soon, and then, potentially ramps up more support to Ukraine? This is unexpected, but I think Trump is working on a clock. And he's impatient for results. What if that doesn't happen?
I agree. I think if you had asked me this a few months ago, I would have said that this is a realistic scenario, given the writings we've seen from people like Keith Kellogg, his Ukraine envoy, from Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, who wrote an essay for my publication, The Economist, in which he said, look, we're going to apply pressure to the Russians. We're going to push the oil price down. We will ramp up sanctions. We may arm the Ukrainians. Having said that, looking at Trump's approach to this, it is clear to me he has some degree of ideological affinity with the Russians. He likes strong leaders, whether they are autocratic or not, and he has a degree of contempt for the Ukrainians. We've heard how he has called Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's elected president, a dictator, how he is pressuring him for a minerals deal to hand over $500 billion worth of revenue from mining and other extraction. For all of those reasons, I am pretty skeptical, Vishnu, right now, that this is a president who is willing to seriously turn hostile towards Vladimir Putin. And that is why my colleagues in Europe, my peers in Europe, are so gravely concerned about what we are seeing from our European perspective.
What if Trump keeps on sidelining Zelensky and Ukraine, as he's done by and large so far, and then tries to strike out a deal himself, and then sort of presents it as a deal which Ukraine has to take it or leave it? And I see that actually as the present scenario, and one where you've got Ukraine supported by several European nations on the one hand, and Trump sort of going it alone in terms of his vision of the road ahead. Do you see this scenario going forward?
I agree with you that that is the most likely situation. But I think he has to be careful, because although Ukraine is significantly dependent on the United States for the provision of some key military and intelligence capabilities, things like air defense, for instance, if a deal is so lopsided and so punitive and includes no serious security guarantees, for Zelensky to sign it would be signing his political death warrant. It would provoke unrest within Ukraine. It could even prompt a coup within Ukraine. The military would not necessarily go along with it. Similarly, for Europeans, European states could not go along with a deal, for instance, that legally handed over 20% of Ukraine to Russia, a forcible change of borders in Europe. We couldn't do it. Europeans couldn't do it. In that situation, Zelensky, although he would pay a very high price, make no mistake, could absolutely walk away from the table, and he would have to then deal with the consequences. Europeans could provide some aid. They could not make up the entire difference, but they could provide some aid to keep him in the game. That is eminently a possible situation right now.
What if Trump were to actually broker a deal, one that everybody accepts? Is that out of the realm of possibility?
I wouldn't say so. I think that the Russians also, as you and I discussed a couple of weeks ago, face significant economic and military pressures. They are losing about 1,200, 1,300 men a day, killed and wounded, and moving at a snail's pace through eastern Ukraine. You know, they're losing thousands upon thousands of men to take a few square meters here and there. So they also may feel under some pressure. For me, the key here is, how would that deal be enforced? What would be the guarantees received by Ukraine? Right now, European states are seriously discussing the prospect of a military deployment inside Ukraine as a kind of reassurance force. This would be something maybe about division-sized, low tens of thousands, maybe deployed to Ukrainian cities, critical infrastructure, nuclear power plants, ports, as a way of guarding against a renewed Russian invasion. But this is the catch. Here's the catch. If America wants a deal like this, it will need to be able to provide a backstop to that European deployment. If it is unwilling to do that, we may have no security guarantees and a thin, weak, fragile deal that, like the Minsk agreement signed 10 years ago, could collapse in relatively short order. If the American government is willing to provide that backstop, I think that the possibilities are much more expansive than they are today.
A final possibility, what if Trump were to throw his hands up and say, look, none of you have come to the table in the way that I want you to, and walks out? In other words, decides that he's not going to bankroll Ukraine in any way or arm Ukraine in any way. What is the immediate consequence of that? Is Europe prepared to actually defend Ukraine in the manner that they need to indefinitely at this stage, if that were to take place?
I think it would cause a serious crisis within Ukraine. They would begin to suffer serious artillery shortages. Europe could make up some of those, but what Europe cannot compensate for entirely is some of the intangible assistance that's being given to Ukraine. For instance, intelligence about Russian aerial attacks using American intelligence assets. Also, things like air defense interceptors. And as those interceptors begin to run dry, you would see Russian air power potentially asserting itself over Ukraine with deadly consequences. Now, here's the thing. Europeans currently provide, Vishnu, about 60% of the aid to Ukraine. Americans provide 40%. You wouldn't know that if you just listened to Donald Trump. So we could keep the Ukrainians in the field for some time. You know, they would be able to get through the year, I believe, without suffering from a sudden a critical collapse. We're not going to see a kind of Kabul in Kiev in the same way. However, there is a limit to this process. We do not have the defense industrial capacity because we simply have not been diligent enough at investing in it over the 3 years of this conflict to keep Ukraine sustained indefinitely. There would be serious and I believe eventually catastrophic implications if America was to cut and run completely.
And that really does bring me to my final question. America cutting and running. If you just take a look at some of J.D. Vance's remarks, right? And you heard them, you were there. And let me just quote, on the internal threat to Europe, the threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external factor. What I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values shared with the United States of America. This is unthinkable, unthinkable. This is America pulling the rug under Europe's feet. It's challenging the premise of NATO.
I agree. And, you know, last night, Vishnu, I listened to the German election results come in. And Friedrich Merz, who is Germany's presumptive next chancellor, his party has emerged as the biggest in Germany's parliament. It'll need a coalition, but he's the next leader of Germany. He went on German television within hours of winning and said some remarkable things that I have never heard a European leader say in that way. He said, America does not care about the fate of Europe. He said we need an independent European defense capability. And he said he doesn't even know if NATO will exist in its current form by the time of the NATO summit, which is 3 or 4 months away. These are astonishing things to hear from the mouth of a European leader. And so it isn't about the number of troops in Europe. It isn't about deployments. It's about the psychology of whether America has Europe's back. And all around me, I see a European continent that is reeling with shock, dealing with the aftermath of this, and asking itself, what will it take to defend ourselves? 3% of GDP, 4% of GDP? How long will it take? Can we replace American enablers, intelligence, airlift, command and control? Can we replace America's nuclear umbrella? There are quiet conversations taking place amongst Brits, French, and their nuclear arsenals about how they can expand this to the rest of Europe. We really are in the period of the most radical change in European security than at any time in my lifetime, and I suspect at any time since 1945.
Yeah, the Second World War. Shashank, thanks very much for joining us. These are very challenging times, not just for Europe, around the world. What happens next in Ukraine and Russia impacts so many. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Thanks.